Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. Now, I bet you didn't wake up this morning thinking, if only I could replace lettuce with tree leaves. And it sounds wild, but some tree leaves are in fact edible and very delicious. And not only that, they're easy to grow and highly, highly nutritious. Now, before you think, oh, you know what, my garden is too small to grow trees, many of them can be coppiced or pollarded to be kept small and compact, and many of them also shrubs which you could train up against a wall or something. This is a little extract from a chat that I had with Joshua Sparks, who I visited in Devon. He's a natural farming pioneer, and he absolutely blew my mind when it came to this little part of this podcast segment.
One of the things I was quite excited to hear is how you're actually planting, like how much you're doing with perennial salads, but you're growing things like limes and white mulberries and Chardonnay. Great.
Yeah.
Can you chat a little bit more about that and why?
Yeah, so, with how our climate's going, it's getting more difficult to grow, especially in those early seasons like March, April, May. Start of May are bonkers now. And what we've noticed is the things that do really well are the trees. Don't get touched by slugs, don't get hit by anything, grow in the wind, can grow everywhere. And we've taken the decision now to focus more on perennial foods in general, but especially perennial salads. So we developed 2 beautiful perennial salads this year that have been really successful, and it's kind of given us the confidence to be like, actually, this does work. You can actually produce a salad without having to use lettuce and rocket. Delicious salads as well, may I add.
It is important.
Yeah.
If you want people to change, you have to enjoy it.
Yeah, and I think perennials fit into that ever so slight foraging remit sometimes. My uncle.
Leaves off a tree.
Yeah, my uncle says it perfectly. He thinks that foragers are like wine connoisseurs, and they'll give you something to try, and it tastes absolutely disgusting, but they'll tell you it's the best tasting thing in the world. And I think perennials can sit within that sphere slightly. There are a lot of horribly tasting perennials, just that there's a lot of delicious tasting perennials. And so we've spent a long time developing salads with things that taste good, that are efficient to pick, that have a business point of view, and they're not finicky and hard. And so for us, what came out on tops was lime leaf, just tilia leaf, and white mulberry leaf, which are beautiful, delicious lettuce alternatives. I think me and Jack were joking, we wanted to create I don't know if hashtags are still a thing, but we wanted to create a hashtag that was limes over lettuce, because they were delicious. And I think I put it into context when I was pricing it out. So I can buy a lime whip for £1.80. A seed packet, a lettuce packet is £2.25 for a small packet. Give it 2 years, that lime tree will produce more leaves than that salad packet. Give it 4 years, and that one lime tree will produce more lettuce than one salad bed. And from a cost point of view as well, it just makes more sense. But they are delicious. Lime leaves, white mulberry. And we can go beyond that. So once we let the white mulberry shoot a little bit, we can actually use white mulberry shoots as a vegetable substitute. And there's another sub-canopy tree, which we call Staphylea pinnata, which usually gets celebrated for its pistachio-tasting nut or seed. But actually, you can use the young shoot as a vegetable as well. So you can just cut the young shoots and saute them a little bit, and then you've got another vegetable alternative. So we can actually use trees as vegetables as well.
What's that one you just mentioned?
A Staphylea pinnata, bladder nut.
Bladder nuts.
And so we can use those crops. Saltbush, a very classic perennial, beautiful in salads, lovely salty. Texture's we have to recreate the texture of a salad, and we do that by adding things like the buckthorn plantain, the hylotelephiums, the sedums, and the saltbushes, and they'll add the texture to the lime trees and the white mulberries that people are looking for, that crunch. But you've got 5 species as opposed to 1, doing the same thing. And we know that, I can't remember the 5th one, but we know that there's the 5 most nutritional crops that we can grow in the north, kind of our temperate climate, is vine leaf, mulberry leaf, lime leaf, and goji berry leaf. I can't remember the 5th one. And those 4 crops are the most nutritionally and mineral dense foods that we can grow in our northern hemisphere.
Are you serious about goji berry leaf?
Yeah, goji berry leaf. And we use goji berry leaf.
Because the thing is, I've been trying to grow goji berries for a few years, and it leaves up great.
Yeah.
But I've never had a berry set.
Goji berry leaf is delicious in a salad. Just a few trickled in. It has this lovely kind of like tangy bitterness. And remember, we grow for chefs, so they want, I can't remember what the 5 pillars of food are, but one of them is bitter. They want bitter, sweet, zest, stuff.
Yeah.
And so what I've learned is actually we're so scared of bitter. We're so terrified of it. It's so good for you. It's like one of the best things you can eat for your gut is bitter foods. And so just adding a few of those goji berry leaves and just to add a little hint of bitterness that has this kind of zesty heat twist to it is really good. So goji berry leaf is a fantastic salad crop as well. And from in a world where we're living where our food is so nutritionally poor, to grow those foods that are climate resilient, build biodiversity, require minimal input, nothing almost basically, and you're growing something which is dense and fills you up quicker, is a win on all parts really.
I think particularly after this growing season and the slug onslaught, one of the exciting things about tree leaves is that slugs just aren't interested in them. And another part of the discussion I had with Joshua was about how he uses beetles as one of his key ways of dealing with slugs. You would look at his farm and think it's just slug habitat everywhere. But ground beetles are a very exciting part, and I think we can all learn something from it. So here's that little clip.
One of the things that kind of struck me is what you said about you actually being a beetle farmer. I've never heard of that before.
I joke.
Why is that?
So beetles are really the kind of, if you exclude like the soil microbes and the fungi and that, from a ecosystem point of view, I think the beetles are the foundation to build on.
Interesting.
Beetles start, for me anyway, how I see it is beetles are the start of that kind of like ecosystem equilibrium that we're always trying to find. And because of that, slug is our biggest predator. Like everyone's experienced this year especially, slugs just decimate everything. And I think they're always seen as the villain, and they're always seen as the kind of like I would say how people see natural farming not working is because of slugs. So what we have to do is focus on beetle populations. And so really a lot of the decisions we make, whether it's from our agroforestry or field layout or kind of habitat control, is really to build beetles. That's what we focus on as the farmers, and that's why I joke that we're beetle farmers, because we're doing everything to maintain those beetle populations. And then really from building those beetle populations up, it's almost like, kind of flicking the dominoes, building them up, build something else up, and then very quickly you start to rebuild that ecosystem. And then you find that your slugs are kept in balance. And then the beetles also keep other pests like sawfly in balance, or carrot root fly in balance, or cabbage root fly in balance, because they eat everything in the soil as well. And then from that, you can just build a system that doesn't require so much netting or digging or anything like that, really. And so we leave grass in the field. We create slug habitat because beetles like the same habitat as slugs. They live side by side, and so we almost want slugs, because the more slugs I have, the more beetles I get. And you never want to eradicate the slug. You eradicate the slug, the beetle will go somewhere else to find them. And it's that classic like hero paradox. You need the villain in order to be a hero. And the beetles very much are kind of Batman's, and the slug is the Joker. And so, kind of almost reluctantly say that we almost encourage slugs in the system because we want the beetles to have the food as well.
I have to say, I think that's the first time I've heard growers say, slugs, you need more slugs.
Yeah, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The first couple of years when we took the farm from a pasture, and we turned it into what it is today, it was tough because we just didn't have the beetle populations. It had been a cultivated field, it had been sprayed, it had been lay, it had been everything that beetles don't want to be in. And it's taken a good 3 to 4 years now for those beetles to come back in such a population that they make a massive impact on the ecosystem. And like I said, like it is honestly like flicking dominoes. Now they've come back, everything's just kind of slotting into place really nicely. And, we can put things out, and like we can put trays and trays of lettuces and onions and brassicas out. And we know that we're going to have probably a 90-95% survival rate from what we put out as well, and you lift up a plank of wood or you move a piece of grass, and there'll always be a beetle or a centipede kind of just scurrying around as well.
I definitely saw the biggest centipede I've ever seen in my life here.
No, a lot of centipedes. But we also have to recognise like mice and voles are big slug predators. Grass snakes are big slug predators when they're young. There's a lot of things that eat slugs out there. It's just the fact that because we keep so much of that ecosystem out of our food growing, the slugs just have free reign because there's nothing there to eat them. We were talking in the field that, we have an ecologist who helps us to make sure that everything we do is to the best that we can. And we know that beetles have an active hunting range of between 12 to 20 meters. at night. And so what we've done is put our agroforestry at 12-metre distances, so at least the beetle can get from one tree row to another at night and not have to panic about getting back in the daytime when a bird could grab it or something else could grab it. So it's decisions like that which are predominantly for the beetles.
If you want to get your mind blown by the type of work that Joshua Sparks is doing, I've got a video coming up soon about it, but we do have an hour-and-a-half long chat that you can watch right here, all about his methods, his approach, and I learnt so much from it. So give that a watch.